All Eurocentric thought and philosophy is detrimental to people of color. I didn't say some and I didn't say most, I said all. And I say this because Eurocentric theology and philosophy does not include me or us. When a certain slaveholder who took advantage of his female slave wrote the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," in his mind, he did not include his slaves. And everyone who read that knew that black people were not included in having life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. As a small boy living across the Hudson in Jackson Heights, Queens, when I went to Blessed Sacrament and put my hand over my heart and said the Pledge of Allegiance, even as a child, I knew that liberty and justice for all did not include me. So the question is, why must I accept and embrace a theology and a philosophy that purposely excludes me? But before I begin talking about that, I need to first confront how much I have accepted the dominant way of thinking. When I was living in Miami and driving up to New York one day when I was in my 20s, with my hair down to my shoulders, with the windows rolled down, listening to the Gran Combo, I got pulled over in New Jersey by one of the Freudian slip, by one of the police officers who stopped me for going 5 miles over the speed limit. Then he asked to search my car, which I, of course, said yes, because he has a gun. After he searched my car, I asked him, what are you looking for? And he said, well, young Latinos with Dade County license plate are suspected of bringing coke to New York. This is back in the 70s, early 80s. And I said, well, search. He didn't find anything. And as I drove away, what went through my mind was, thank God the cops are doing their job and keeping us safe. You see, my mind was so colonized, I have learned to see myself through the eyes of my oppressor that I began to define myself the way my oppressors define me. So the first thing that I have to do is I have to decolonize my own mind. And the only way I could decolonize my mind is to reject the very philosophy and the very theology that caused that colonization in the first place. José Martí, the great Cuban revolutionary of the late 19th century, probably said it best. El vino de plátano y si sale agrio sigue siendo nuestro vino. For those of you who do not yet know the language of the angels, let me translate for you. We will make our wine out of plantains, and even if it tastes sour, it is still our wine. By the same token, I will make my philosophy and my theology using my own symbols, and even if it doesn't taste well, it's still mine. And because it's mine, it has value and it has worth. And as long as I refuse to decolonize my mind, I have no doubt God vomits. So, why is my mind so colonized? The problem with Eurocentric philosophical and theological thought is it is so abstract, it is so convoluted, it is so complex that it hides in that complexity my exclusion and my oppression. Because if it's so hard to understand, we think it must be true, because I don't understand it. But in that complexity is how I'm left off. Give you a quick example, Hegel. Hegel gives us the metaphysical historical dialect. And what he basically says is that history moves in stages in an upward procession, right? It begins in the East, the most primitive people, and it moves towards the most advanced people, which happens to be the center of Germany. It skips over Africa and Native Americans because, they're so primitive that they have nothing to offer the historical movement. Okay? And this history that Hegel gives us, of which most of Western philosophy is based on, purposely excluded us from the conversation and from the way of thinking. So again, why should I be embracing this? See, unfortunately, I think I drank the Foucault Kool-Aid, in where it seems to me that history has no rhyme or reason. History doesn't have this upward movement progression. It can move forward, it can move backwards, it could go around in circles. It is disconnected. But see, if we connect history as though it somehow is moving upward, we somehow then feel hopeful because in the end, it's all going to work out. And this is why hope is one of those concepts that we have to reject if we want to liberate ourselves from these structures of oppression. You see, hope is a middle-class privilege. When I took a group of students to Cuernavaca, and we went to the squatter villages to hear from the poor how our riches is causing their poverty, one of my white students afterwards said, "I know this is horrible, but when I looked at the little girl, I saw the hope in her eyes." At that moment, I had an epistemological meltdown. Because my response to her was, "I'm not quite sure what you saw in her eyes, but in about 5 or 6 years, you're going to be turning tricks to put food on the table or stuck in an abusive marriage. She is stuck in poverty for the rest of her life, and so is her children and her grandchildren. And the only reason you cling to hope is because it excuses you from having to do anything or to realize how you are responsible for her poverty." Every so often, Jesus appears in a tortilla. and what's going on is that our minds are literally wired to see order in disorder. So if I tell you that in this grain you could see a face, you will see a face. Okay? Your mind is geared that way. I would argue that in the same way, history is our mind trying to put logic to it and therefore trying to put the face of God in history. If that is true, then truly when I stand at the summit and I look at the movement of history, it is but an illusion because it seems to be moving in a progression, but in reality it is a chaotic mess with things going in opposite directions. The reason that hope works in Eurocentric philosophy, according to Moltmann, is because at the end of this logically progressive history, God will keep God's promises. Okay? Don't tell the Jews that because apparently the Holocaust is a proof that God did not keep God's promise to the Jews. That's another story. But the point is, Moltmann tells us that God keeps God's promises, and we can hope in that, okay? And then at that point, we'll be able to look back into history and see the hand of God all along. And everything's going to make sense. I'm sorry. The Inquisition, the Crusades, slavery, colonialism, our current engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq, they don't make sense. And I don't care if I could see all of history, it is still abusive, it is still horrible, and there is no reason or rhyme to it. So history is an illusion that gives us some type of hope that may occur. MLK may have said that the arc of the moral universe is long but is bent towards justice. But I would say if it's going to bend, we're the ones that have to do the bending. Because it's not going to bend by itself, because the moral universe could care less which way it bends. Vanity of vanity, says the teacher, absolute futility, everything is meaningless. Preach that on Sunday. Ecclesia 1:1. The reason why I reject hope is because if I'm going to be in radical solidarity with the least of these my brethren, they are living in the space of Saturday, where all they know is the death and the gore of crucifixion. They may be a Sunday, but there's not a rush to it because they're still stuck in this Saturday. And the worst thing I could do is sit with them and say, oh, don't worry, all things work for good for those who are called according to God's purposes. If I'm going to be in solidarity, I don't come to paternalistically excuse their suffering and say, don't worry, it's all going to work out. I sit in the dust with them on Saturday. And I cry with them and I share their pain. And they may be a Sunday. And if there is, hallelujah. But sometimes there is not a Sunday. I'm sure you heard some preachers say some sermon about the little girl at the beach who is throwing starfishes back into the ocean because of the storm that came. And there's a grumpy old man that says, you can't save them all. And she picks one and says, I'll save this one, and throws it back in. Yeah, I'm the grumpy old man. Because as long as we, and this again, Eurocentric thought, as long as we individualize hope to the one starfish, yes, a starfish may be saved, but the hope has been choked out of me by the stench of the flesh and bodies of the thousands of starfish that are still laying, dying in the desert, for whom hope ended when they died under oppression. And those are the folks I am in solidarity with. Now again, don't get me wrong. Every once in a while I'm in the desert and somebody comes to me and, who crossed the desert and says something like, oh, yes, it was bad, but La Virgencita appeared to me and led me. And I say, oh, hallelujah, amen, this is great. I'm not, there needs to be some pastoral counseling here. But what I'm thinking is, what about the 5 other brown bodies that perish in the desert every 4 days because of our immigration policies? You see, there's always one we could put on a pedestal to prove that there is hope. But my eyes are upon those for whom there is no hope. Primo Levi probably said it best. Primo Levi, as you know, he was the Auschwitz inmate who said, there is no God, there is just Auschwitz. And before I tell Primo Levi, no, you have to believe, I have to first sit with him and understand the anguish that has led him to say this profession. I mean, let's face it, we have to really ask, where is God in the hopelessness? I mean, sometimes God is absent. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And again, theology gives us all this stuff about Jesus being all sin, God couldn't look upon Jesus, and then foreturned. No, that's just theology. That's excusing God for the reality of God's absence. Sometimes God is really sadistic. Have you read Job? I mean, really. He makes a bet with Satan to kill all of Job's children and take his wealth and make him ill. And then for like about 59 chapters, you're trying to figure out why. And at the end, what does God say? Tough crap. I do whatever I want to do, and how dare you even ask me? I have to wrestle with that God. And sometimes, and I think we Christians lost this that I think Jewish tradition has still captured. God sometimes have a dark side. I mean, Isaiah, what does it say in Isaiah? If good or evil enters into the city, it is not I, God, who brings it. God brings good and evil to the city. I mean, think about that. Or wasn't it God who sent the evil spirits unto Saul? God sends evil spirits? So you see, I mean, we have to invent a Satan to try to excuse and fix God so that God could not have this complexity to God. But see, I want to embrace that complexity. Like Jacob, I want to wrestle with God even though I may walk away limping. Miguel De Unamuno has really influenced me a lot. He's the unbelieving believer. And what he argues is, you can never prove that God exists. And you can never prove that God does not exist. And all this Eurocentric philosophical thought trying to prove God is foolishness. Because there's no way to prove the existence or the non-existence of God. It's called faith. And where faith doesn't rely on rational thought, but the Eurocentric model is that everything must rely on rational thought, even the existence of God, which can never be rationally proven. Okay? So I am a man of faith. I'm just trying to still figure out what that faith is because of the complexity of this God that I'm trying to understand. So Miguel de Unamuno says, there may be a God, there may be not. You know, it's better to believe in God than not, so, you know, just do that. And that's what I'm doing. But I'm doing it and wrestling with it. And part of that wrestling is knowing that sometimes hope falls short. So, hope is oppressive because it domesticates us so that we police ourselves. Okay? In other words, when I went to Auschwitz, the sign said, work will set you free. It didn't. But if I had hope that it did, I could keep my head down, not make waves, not fight back, and maybe I'll survive. You see, as long as I have something to lose, I'm not going to make waves and push back very hard. I'll talk the good talk, but you know, I got a nice little house and a pension. I don't want to jeopardize that. So hope really restricts me from radical praxis. When I have nothing to lose, that's when I'm the most dangerous. Wow. That's when radical praxis takes place. Now, some of you are thinking, no, but hope is despair, and we shouldn't be in despair. No, Moltmann was wrong. Hope is not despair. Hope is desperation, and there's a difference. You see, despair, I just roll up in a fetus position and cry and do nothing. Desperation is what forces me to cross a desert even when I know I'll probably die. Because if I stay, I'm going to die anyway. See, despair doesn't move me towards praxis. And hope doesn't move me to praxis. Hope is very, soothing. I mean, quite frankly, hope, the reason people are crossing the desert today is not because they have hope for a better life. They're crossing out of desperation. And if we can mobilize around desperation because we have nothing else to lose, we can turn the world upside down. So how do we do this? I have no idea. But I'll give a few suggestions. Oh, one last thing, I forgot. In Spanish, hope is esperanza, yes. Right? Which comes from the word esperar, right? Which means to wait. And you're not quite sure what you're waiting for. It could be good, it could be bad. So see, when I'm talking about hope, I am speaking about hope in Spanish, which I think really has a more nuanced understanding of this concept than the English would. So, what do? Right now, we have to go to the police department to get a permit from the police department to protest the police department for police brutality. We have domesticated how we even protest so that we don't change the structures. We're giving the space to carry our signs and feel good about ourselves as long as nothing changes. You know, I teach at probably one of the most leftist, liberal theological schools in the country, and every so often my white student says, "Oh, let's all go get arrested." And I say, "I'm a Latino. I don't have to go get arrested." It just happens naturally whenever there's cops around. You know, you guys go get arrested. You know, I'll stay here. And I say that because, you know, bless their hearts. I say that because the last thing I want to do is get arrested, because then the money to keep me out of jail should instead be going to the cause that should be helping, you know, move the agenda forward, not for me to get my badge of courage that, yes, I'm a good, you know, liberal and I got arrested. So, now of course, there are consequences. You know, sometimes when you are fighting for justice, that will happen. I just work hard for it not to. When I was detained by the Border Patrol, and I had about 7 people with me, I said, you know, they're all priests and nuns. This ain't going to look good if in newspapers. Now, they weren't, but they didn't know that. And I'll talk about that in a second. I even began the Mass, and that blew them away. So, but the point is, I try not to, but that could always be a consequences of action. It's not something you seek, you know, unless there's a... So, what do we do? I have developed a terminology, not for something that I invented, but something that I see oppressed people have always done. And I'm just giving it a word based from my own culture. And I'm calling it an ethics para joder. Now, for those of you who know Spanish, I want to apologize for my cursing. And again, for those of you, you really need to learn Spanish. Because I don't curse in English, so I could only say there's a certain 4-letter word that begins with F and ends with K. It is an ethics that screws with the system. You see, when oppressed people are standing before the military, police, industrial complex and where they're going to lose, when neoliberalism continues to operate way after we're all dead, when the structures are so rigged against you, the only thing you could do is what Jesus did, and that is to overturn the bankers' tables in the temple. You have to screw with the system. And I learned this when I was in Mexico. I was speaking to a Zapatista rebel, and he said, you know, I went to the government because they was taking away my land, and I began to explain the hardship, and they looked at me and they said, you dirty Indian, get out of here. So I showed up the next day with a bandana and AK-47, and you know, they listened to me. We had an interesting conversation. Okay. And what I learned is that you can't play by the rules, because those who made the rules made it to ensure that you remain in your subservient position. So let me give you just a quick example. I'm running out of time. A quick example of how this will, and where I'm really getting this from. Like I said, it's not coming from me. I'm not that smart. When I was a small boy living here in New York, there was the Young Lords. I don't know if anybody remembers the Young Lords. They were originally a turf gang, and then they went ahead and began to organize and raise consciousness. And they did many things, but one of my favorite ones is that they collected, you know, they went to the barrio and they started cleaning up the streets, and they collected all the garbage and they, you know, put them in bags. And they called the sanitation department and said, you know, we've cleaned the streets, come pick up the garbage. And they laughed and hung up. So they took all those bags and they went to 3rd Avenue, they built a wall and they set it on fire. During rush hour traffic. That's jodiendo. Because what ends up happening is it called attention to the unfairness of the sanitation department, and now the sanitation department goes to the barrio every Tuesday and Friday. Okay. In other words, by screwing with the systems, you lift up the injustices and put a spotlight on it. let me give you a more recent example. I did this kind of workshop with No More Deaths and Border Links and Samaritans doing one of their anniversaries on dealing with the immigration debate. And what came out of it, first of all, they were relieved that that fixing immigration no longer depended upon them because it wasn't going to be fixed. Therefore, it liberated them to try new things. So not this December, but the year before, doing Operations Streamline, that's the court procedure that pushes people through the system and gets them arrested. During the process, a priest stood up and started asking God for forgiveness for what we're about to do to these immigrants. So the bailiff hauled him away, and then the rabbi stood up and also asked Yahweh for forgiveness, and they took him away, and then the imam stood up and asked Allah for forgiveness, and then they took him away, and then the Protestant stood up and started praying, and it brought the system to a standstill. Now again, nothing changed, but the press and helped raise the consciousness of the injustice that's going on. And these are examples of what I mean by jodiendo, of screwing with the system, of pushing back. Now the reason that I do this, and this is important, because I realize that my hope is I realize it's not going to change, because even if we have change, even if things get better, if we take a step forward, neoliberalism is already 10 steps ahead of us and already has the ways to subvert and take over the movement so that it makes it meaningless. So therefore, it's a constant struggle. So if it's so hopeless, why then bother? Again, this is what I mean, middle-class privilege. See, my parents had no choice but to fight to survive. Okay. And that's what I mean by solidarity. If I don't have to, yeah, I could, watch TV and relax. Try to get as much toys as possible before I die. But if I reject that privilege and am in solidarity, I do this not because I think I'm going to win. I do this because it defines my very humanity and it defines my faith. I have no choice but to joder. Because if I don't, I'm not human. I'm not a man of faith. And I am going to, I'm going to end there, but before I end, I am going, do we have the, we do, okay. In a shameless act of self-promotion. I mean, really, really shameless. I'm going to show you a 2-minute trailer of a film that just came out on Monday for the first time to be available for the public. I showed it here, I think about 3 years ago.
What do you do with someone who breaks into your house, who fixes your deck, who takes care of your garden, who cleans your house, who makes you dinner, who takes care of your children? What is the appropriate penalty for that person?
Oh my God! Keep on walking!
We're seen as an economic, political, cultural threat to this country, to the state of Arizona, and that's what we are, no matter whether we have status as quote-unquote legal or as illegal.
How could I possibly let somebody die here in my backyard? I never thought I would still be walking out here, bringing water and looking for food out here in the desert. Honestly, we don't want any more tragedies out here.
I was in tears, almost uncontrollable anger. I mean, the fact that they're pushed into these very difficult parts of the desert and are, walking when they should be actually in hospitals. This is no way to treat another human being.
Sometimes it's easy if you don't know the situation. If you don't understand it, You can't just have an opinion, good or bad. That's it.
We are all human beings. We are not illegals. We are not aliens. We all deserve the right to an education.
When a nation builds roads into another country to extract its raw material and cheap labors, we shouldn't be surprised when people take those same roads following everything that has been stolen from them.